The red dirt ground is soaked with blood. 35 people are on their knees, their hands tied behind their backs, forming an uneven line in the middle of a clearing in northern Nigeria. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across their faces. Some have their eyes closed, murmuring almost inaudible prayers. Others tremble uncontrollably. In front of them, a row of men armed with AK-47 rifles and machetes await the signal to carry out the sentence. Among the condemned is Amara, a 32-year-old teacher whose tears carve paths through the red dust covering her face. At her side, Pastor Samuel, 57, keeps his eyes open, fixed on the sky, as if expecting something only he can see. There is also Daniel, a teenage boy just 16 years old who holds his mother's hand tightly, even with his wrists tied. The leader of the militants, a tall man with a black turban whom the prisoners know only as the commander, raises his right arm, ready to give the final order. Then something impossible happened. This is not a made-up story. It is not a spiritual metaphor. It is not cinematic fiction created to stir emotions. What you are about to hear was reported by eyewitnesses, documented by international human rights organizations, and confirmed by survivors who still carry the scars of that day. What happened next not only saved 35 lives, but forever transformed the way thousands of people around the world see divine intervention in times of persecution. To understand the magnitude of what happened in that execution field, we need to go back a few hours, pull the camera back, and understand the context that led those 35 people to that moment of absolute terror. It is March 2019, in the state of Borno, in northeastern Nigeria. This area, known as the Persecution Belt, is one of the most dangerous places in the world for Christians. Islamist militant groups, especially Boko Haram and its offshoots, control vast portions of the territory, enforcing Sharia under penalty of death and systematically attacking Christian communities. The village of Kwada is located approximately 80 kilometers from Maiduguri, the state capital. It is a small community of about 300 inhabitants, mostly Christians who live from subsistence farming and small trade. The houses are simple mud and thatch constructions arranged around a small, white-painted masonry church that serves as the spiritual and social heart of the village. Pastor Samuel Adeyemi has led this congregation for 23 years. A man of medium build with graying hair and deep wrinkles that tell stories of decades of ministry in hostile territory, Samuel is known for his unshakable calm and for a phrase he constantly repeats to his flock: "God did not bring us this far to abandon us." By the way, if stories of faith under pressure like this stir something in you and make you want to know the Bible more deeply, I've put together simple PDF study guides with summaries, timelines, and key characters from the Old and New Testaments. They're meant to strengthen your personal walk with God and your family devotional time. The link is in the pinned comment. Later on, feel free to check it out if it sounds helpful to you. On that Thursday morning, the sky was clear and the heat was already intense from the early hours. It was Harmattan season, when dry winds blow from the Sahara, carrying fine dust that coats everything in an orange hue. The air was dense, almost hard to breathe. Amara Okonkwo, the teacher at the village's small school, had arrived early to prepare the day's lessons. She taught children from 6 to 12 years old, using a cracked chalkboard and books donated by a missionary organization. A single mother to a 7-year-old girl named Grace, Amara had lost her husband 2 years earlier in a previous attack that destroyed the neighboring village. Daniel Musa, the 16-year-old teenager, was helping his mother Ruth at the small market where they sold vegetables and grains. He dreamed of becoming a doctor, and every day, after helping with the business, he would study for hours with borrowed books. The village routine followed its normal course. Children ran between the houses, women prepared lunch over open fires, men worked in the nearby fields. No one imagined that this would be the last day of normalcy they would ever know. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, the distant sound of motorcycles began to echo. At first, it seemed like the usual noise of travelers passing on the dirt road that cut through the region. But the sound grew louder, multiplied, drawing closer with terrifying speed. In less than 5 minutes, the village was surrounded. Dozens of armed men dressed in black clothing and turbans that covered their faces invaded Quetta from all directions. Gunshots echoed through the air. Screams of terror mixed with the roar of the motorcycles. People ran in desperation, seeking shelter in their homes, in the church, anywhere that might offer protection. But there was nowhere to run. The militants acted with brutal efficiency. In less than an hour, they had gathered all the villagers in the center of the settlement near the church. Men, women, children, the elderly. Everyone was forced to kneel on the red dirt ground under the scorching sun. The commander, a man of about 40 with a scar running down his face from forehead to chin, walked among the prisoners like a predator sizing up its prey. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made his words even more terrifying. "You have a choice," he announced in Hausa, the region's lingua franca. "Renounce your Christian faith, accept Islam, swear loyalty to the caliphate, and you will live." He paused dramatically, letting the weight of his words settle in the hot air. "Or remain in your blasphemy, and you will die here today, as an example to all the infidels of this land." Can you imagine being in these people's place at that moment? The sun burning your skin, dust filling your lungs, the barrel of a gun pointed at your head, and a man's voice offering your life in exchange for your faith. What would you do? What would you choose? The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the children cried, paralyzed by terror. The only sound was the wind carrying grains of sand that scratched the skin. The commander began to walk among the prisoners, stopping in front of each one, asking the same question. "Do you renounce?" The first to be questioned were the village elders. A 70-year-old man named Ezekiel was the first. When the militant stopped in front of him, the old man lifted his eyes and with a trembling but audible voice said, "I have served my Lord for 70 years. I will not abandon him now." He was dragged aside and thrown into a group the militants called the Condemned. One by one, people were separated. Those who agreed to convert were taken to a corner and forced to recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. But the vast majority, to the attackers' surprise and growing frustration, refused. When the commander reached Amara, he stopped for a long moment. He looked at her with something that could be interpreted as curiosity. "You are a teacher," he said, "an educated woman. Surely you are intelligent enough to understand that your faith is a lie. Renounce it, and you can live to raise your daughter." Amara swallowed hard. Her hands trembled violently. She thought of Grace, her 7-year-old girl who had been sent to stay with relatives in a larger city just a week earlier. She thought about what it would be like for her to grow up an orphan. She thought about how easy it would be to say the words that would save her life. But then she looked at the children she taught, many of them there, kneeling around her, watching her. What would she be teaching them if she denied everything she believed in just to save her own skin? "My faith is not a lie," she answered, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "And my daughter does not need a coward for a mother. She needs an example." The commander's frustration was evident. He had expected fear to break these people. He had expected the survival instinct to outweigh their convictions. But village after village, community after community, he found the same inexplicable resistance. Pastor Samuel was the last to be questioned. The commander stopped in front of him and said nothing for a long moment. The two men looked at each other, one armed with rifles and machetes, the other armed only with his faith. "You are their leader," the commander finally said. "If you renounce, many will follow your example. You can save lives today." Samuel slowly shook his head. I have no authority to negotiate for the souls of my flock. And you are mistaken if you think our faith depends on me. It depends on the one who is greater than all of us." He paused and then added with a calm that unsettled even the militants, "And he is watching everything that happens here today." By the end of the selection, 35 people had refused to renounce their faith. Among them were Pastor Samuel, teacher Amara, teenager Daniel and his mother Ruth, 3 church elders, and 28 other community members, including 6 children under 12. They were taken to a clearing about 2 kilometers from the village, a place the militants had used before for executions. The ground still showed dark bloodstains from previous victims. The sun was beginning to sink on the horizon when the 35 condemned were placed on their knees in an uneven line. Their hands were tied behind their backs with coarse ropes that cut into their skin. Some were forced to dig their own shallow graves in the dry earth. Daniel, the teenager who dreamed of becoming a doctor, managed to position himself next to his mother Ruth. Even with his wrists tied, he found a way to intertwine his fingers with hers. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm not afraid." Ruth, tears streaming silently down her face, replied, "I know, my son. I'm not either. Not anymore." Pastor Samuel, placed at the center of the line, began to softly sing a hymn in Igbo, his mother tongue. One by one, the other condemned joined the singing. It was a simple hymn that spoke of walking through the valley of the shadow of death without fearing any evil. Their voices were weak, trembling, off-key from fear and thirst. But there was something in that singing that deeply disturbed the executioners. Several of them exchanged uneasy looks. One of the younger militants, a boy who didn't seem to be more than 20, stepped away a few paces, unable to look directly at the victims. The commander, visibly irritated, ordered silence. When the prisoners continued to sing, he fired a shot into the air. The singing stopped, but their mouths kept moving in silent prayer. "You had your chance," he declared. "Now you will face the consequences of your stubbornness." He raised his right arm, preparing to give the execution signal. The militants lifted their weapons. Some drew machetes. The moment stretched, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. It was at this exact moment that something began to change. At first, no one understood what was happening. One of the militants at the edge of the formation lowered his weapon and pointed to the horizon, shouting something unintelligible. Others followed his gaze. To the west, where the sun should have been setting in a clear orange sky, something impossible was forming. A dark mass, almost black, appeared on the horizon with a speed that defied any meteorological explanation. It was not a normal cloud formation. It was as if night itself were advancing prematurely, swallowing the sky piece by piece. Still on his knees, Pastor Samuel lifted his eyes and saw it. His lips formed a single word that several survivors would later confirm hearing. Finally. The storm advanced with supernatural speed. In a matter of minutes, what had been a dot on the horizon became a wall of clouds covering the entire western sky. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze carrying dust from the Sahara, turned into violent gusts that nearly knocked people over. The commander shouted orders, trying to maintain control of the situation. But his men were visibly shaken. In the local culture, storms that appear out of nowhere are considered messages from the supernatural, and this storm was anything but natural. The first lightning bolts tore across the sky while the mass of clouds was still some distance away. But they were not ordinary lightning bolts. Witnesses later described strikes that seemed to hit the ground in deliberate patterns, forming a semicircle around the execution site, as if creating a barrier. The thunder that followed was so intense that several militants fell to the ground, covering their ears. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physical, a vibration that seemed to travel through the body and make the bones tremble. And then came the rain, but calling it rain would be a grotesque understatement. It was a curtain of water so dense that visibility dropped to practically zero in seconds. The prisoners, still on their knees, could barely see one another even though they were less than a meter apart. The wind intensified even more, reaching speeds that ripped shrubs from the ground and turned grains of sand into painful projectiles. The militants' motorcycles were knocked over and dragged. Equipment and weapons were torn from their owners' hands. In the midst of the chaos, something happened that none of the survivors can explain to this day. A lightning bolt struck the ground exactly between the line of prisoners and the line of executioners. Not inches away, not nearby, but precisely in the space that separated the two groups, like a sword of fire dividing the field into two distinct territories. The commander, who was closest to the point of impact, was thrown backward with such force that he flew several meters before hitting the ground. Other militants ran in panic, abandoning their weapons and fleeing in all directions. What happened in the following minutes remains partially hazy in the survivors' memories. The combination of fear, exhaustion, dehydration, and the shock of what they witnessed created gaps in their accounts. But certain details are consistent in all testimonies. The storm, which had formed and intensified with impossible speed, lasted approximately 40 minutes. During that time, the prisoners remained in the same place, unable to move because of their bonds, but protected by some phenomenon that none of them can explain. Amara would later describe it this way: "The rain was falling around us. We could see it, hear its noise, but it was as if there was something covering us. We weren't completely dry, but we weren't as drenched as we should have been. It was like someone had opened an invisible umbrella over our heads." When the storm finally subsided and the sky began to clear, the 35 prisoners looked around and realized they were alone. Every one of the militants had disappeared, having fled during the chaos, abandoning weapons, motorcycles, and equipment. Pastor Samuel was the first to manage to stand up, even with his hands still tied. He walked over to Daniel, the teenager still kneeling beside his mother, and used his teeth to help loosen his bonds. One by one, the survivors freed themselves and helped one another. When everyone was finally free, they spontaneously formed a circle in the very place where, minutes earlier, they had awaited death. And there, soaked, exhausted, still trembling from fear and cold, they began to sing the same hymn they had intoned before the storm. But this time their voices were not weak or trembling. They were strong, full of a joy that transcended any rational explanation. Some cried as they sang, others laughed. Many did both at the same time. Amara fell to her knees, no longer as a prisoner but in gratitude. "I saw the hand of God today," she kept repeating through sobs. "I saw it with my own eyes." News of what happened in Quetta spread quickly. When the survivors returned to the village and reported the events, they were initially met with skepticism. But the evidence was undeniable. The motorcycles abandoned by the militants were still in the clearing, some damaged by the storm. Weapons, ammunition, and equipment had been left behind. And, more significantly, meteorological records for the region showed no forecast of a storm for that day. No natural explanation for the phenomenon that dozens of people had witnessed. Investigators from Open Doors, an international organization that monitors the persecution of Christians around the world, arrived in the region 2 weeks later. They interviewed the survivors separately in different locations to check the consistency of their accounts. What they found was remarkable. Despite small variations in peripheral details, the core of the story was identical in every testimony. In more than 20 years of investigating cases of religious persecution, declared Markus Reimann, a German researcher with the organization, I have never come across a case with so many witnesses reporting the same extraordinary event so consistently. Something happened in that field that defies conventional explanation. Meteorologists consulted were also perplexed. Dr. Olumide Fashola, a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Lagos, analyzed the available data and concluded, The formation and behavior of this storm do not match any known meteorological pattern for the region at that time of year. The speed of formation, the localized intensity, and the rapid dissipation are, from a scientific standpoint, significant anomalies. Some of the militants themselves were later captured in Nigerian army operations. Under interrogation, several of them confirmed the events of that day, though they interpreted them differently. One captured fighter, a 23-year-old, told investigators, "I saw things that day that made me question everything. The storm, the lightning, the way it came out of nowhere. Our commander said it was just weather, just nature. But I was there. That was not natural. There was something else happening." The survivors of Quetta were no longer the same people who had woken up that Thursday morning. What they experienced changed them in deep and permanent ways. Pastor Samuel, who had already dedicated more than 2 decades to ministry in that dangerous region, found a new purpose. "Before that day, I preached about God's faithfulness. I believed in it. But now I have witnessed it. There is a difference between faith based on teaching and faith based on experience. Both are valid, but the latter carries a weight that words cannot convey." In the following months, Samuel began to travel throughout northeastern Nigeria, visiting threatened Christian communities and sharing the testimony of Quetta. His words carried an authority that did not come from titles or positions, but from scars and lived experience. Wherever he went, churches that had been considering leaving the region found the courage to remain. Amara, the teacher who had chosen to be an example for her daughter instead of saving her own life, returned to her calling with renewed fervor. But now she did not teach only letters and numbers. She taught resilience, courage, and faith.